Please note, this episode includes topics that listeners may find upsetting, particularly around the topic of suicide.
So Toby, welcome.
Hi.
Thanks very much for coming on the podcast. Really
Pleasure.
happy to see you. Do you want to start off by just telling us a little bit about kind of your journey and how you've got to where you are, particularly with Campfire and like that great place that I really enjoy being as well.
Yeah, great. Well, I started off not as a businessman at all, but as what I thought would be somebody going into the world of NGOs and more charitable stuff. But I grew up in a family that had a bit of that, and also had a father who ran a very sort of mission-driven business. And at a certain point, I thought I wanted to get involved, and that began what then became me taking over the business when I was about 29, 30. During a period of huge change. So it was once upon a time a travel guide business, and then along came Amazon and TripAdvisor and Airbnb and all those threats to the world of travel. So I had a really, I guess, tumultuous, difficult and quite painful journey in running something, combined with it being a family business and all that goes with that. And during that period, I realized that a lot of what I was facing wasn't just the practical challenges of the operational challenges of running a business, but they were really human challenges of confidence and identity and can I do this? Do I want to do this? Feeling unsupported at times, feeling very uncertain. At the same time as having to take an organization through an awful lot of change, which sort of leads me to where I am today, which is having left that business after 8 years and we moved it into employee ownership. I decided I wanted to set up the group that I wish I'd been able to be part of whilst I was running Sawdays. And it's a group called Campfire, which you're part of, which is about creating a confidential, intimate space for people who run businesses to come and talk about what's really going on. And that's from the challenges of running the business, but also the challenges of being the human being running the business. And I think when you're in a group like that, which is completely confidential and with others who are walking a similar path, you have an opportunity to just talk really candidly about what's going on. And I think it's a really important thing that men, which we'll get onto in a minute, find really hard to do, or rather there are very few places where they feel it's okay to do.
Yeah. And so I've followed you on that journey quite a lot because obviously we first met when we were part of a chief execs group that is kind of, I guess, the corporate version of Campfire is quite well established.
Yeah.
Very sort of in the muck of actually running a business, very kind of task oriented, if you like, challenge oriented around the business front. And sort of touches upon some of the personal challenges and how that affects things, but the focus is really on just like tactics for improving the business and how to get a better strategy and all that sort of stuff. So the interesting thing is that we were both part of that. You now run Campfire, which I'm now part of, and that it's looking at the differences between those two is quite interesting as well, because Campfire is so much more human oriented. Everything is about our interactions with other people and ourselves, and within the group, outside the group, professionally, personally, and it's very sort of focused around the very human element, which is quite different. And Campfire is for men only, which I think is bold and unique because that's there's a lot of drive for female only spaces, but actually the drive for male only spaces is a relatively new phenomenon, which you kind of seem to be on the front foot of. What made you feel like it needed to be a space for men?
Well, originally it wasn't. It happened to be, like so many groups of business people, it happened to be only men in the room. And that frankly was quite uncomfortable for a period. And I really sought to try and make it a mixed gender group. But what I realized is that there are groups that specifically focus on supporting female leaders in Bristol, where we are. And just to the point when we were agonizing about whether it's actually really appropriate to have an all-male group, we had a session where somebody talked very frankly, and it was really important that they were able to do that. They talked frankly about what was going on for them in their marriage. And at the end of the meeting, we reflected, would that conversation have been able to happen if there were women in the room with us? And the person who brought the issue to the group felt that wouldn't be the case. And so rather than thinking of it as a weakness, I suddenly realized actually maybe this is a real strength. This is a place where conversations that men are not having elsewhere can happen. And rightly or wrongly, I believe that women naturally have a real gift for gathering together and talking about what's going on for them. And if you see two women meet for the first time, having not seen each other for a while, it's often like, how are you? There's a real sort of desire to know what's going on. And men meet, and it's often the exchange of data. It'll be like sort of what's going on with your business, how the kids doing in the sports teams they're part of. And so I put all that together and thought, well, actually, maybe it's really important that we create Campfire as a men-only space, because I think so many of the problems we're facing in the world are rooted in the fact that men are not connected to themselves or to what's going on for them. They're not connected to others. And actually, in a small way, Campfire can be a place where that can start to really happen. So, and I also think that there is the group that both you and I are part of, which is a really important part of my sort of transition as a leader, and I'm very grateful to the time I spent in it. But one of the things I realized is that when people in the business world often focus on goals, there's often very little challenge of why those goals are important, what it means to use a human. And I think one of the things I would love to think is that Campfire can be a place where if somebody says they want to do something or they're aiming to achieve a certain goal, the people around the table can say, but what's that about? And why is that important? Rather than just accepting and going with it, which is, I think, what a lot of business focus groups do. They're very goal orientated without really asking, but what's the motivation behind that? I hope Campfire can do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I remember back in that group doing one of those goal setting exercises, being really clear about the goals that I wanted to achieve, and then going on and achieving the goals are incredibly powerful motivators for some people, and for me in particular. But you're right, there was never a moment in that where anyone said, and why? Why those goals? It's just, great, you have goals, there's something to achieve here, go get them. Yeah, but and lots of support in going and getting them, and kind of it feeds the drive really well. But no one actually said, and why? Like, why is that important? Why do you want those things? And looking back on it, I guess I could kind of think, well, these were really motivational, but I'm actually not entirely sure why I did it. Just seemed like the done thing,
Yeah, for me.
and there wasn't that level of challenge in it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of men are driven by sort of external symbols of success. In part, that's what we're told we need to do. And it's not necessarily a healthy driving force. And so to not question that, I think, is a shame. And what's interesting in Campfire, because it typically is men of our vintage and upwards, is that those questions about, well, why was I chasing that goal in the first place? And what even is success? And am I content with the sacrifices that I've been making in order to pursue those goals? Those questions begin to seem to come in when people have kids or have gone through their sort of pushy 20s and 30s of career focus.
Yeah. There's something about midlife reflection in there as well, I think, probably, isn't there?
Yeah.
You get to a certain point when you're thinking, actually, am I halfway now? When you think, you start to reassess now, don't you?
Yeah. And what was the point of it? What's the point of me?
Yeah.
And there's a big questions to contend with. And I think to contend with them on your own is a bit of a lonely pursuit, whereas to contend with them in a group of other people who are also facing those things makes you feel, A, I'm not alone, B, perhaps there's some wisdom that's being gathered by other people in the group that can benefit me. And so it feels like an important thing, actually, to be able to entertain those questions in a community.
Yeah. And since Campfire started, there's been quite a lot of science and literature written about the plight of men and of boys specifically, and our position in the world and how that's changed and what that means. How's that impacted the sort of level of conversation and what happens within Campfire, do you think?
I think maybe it just opens up the idea that it's not the case that men should only carry shame for what privileges they've had in the world, but there are also things that are challenging. And I think, I wouldn't expect necessarily men of, our parents' generation to accept that was the case. I think the idea that there are challenges that men are facing mean that we're probably having more candid conversations as part of Campfire. I still think it's a very tough thing to concede that as a man, you're faced with maybe even systemic or cultural challenges, because we quite rightly have been the beneficiaries of the disproportionate sort of privilege that men have had. But it's no doubt the case that things are shifting. And I had a very interesting example of how hard it is for perhaps men to have an open conversation with people who aren't men about this. When I talked about the Boys and Men book by Richard Reeves with two women close in my life, and I raised the idea that there are challenges that men are facing, and I could feel the bristles sort of rise around the table to the point that I felt I was on dangerous territory actually talking about this stuff. And these are people I love who are very close to me, who are very open-minded. But it just shows the sort of instinctive reluctance to entertain the idea that there are challenges systemically that men face.
Because we've been told quite correctly for many years that men have had the upper hand, women have been have had the raw deal of life for a long time. We're really lucky. We're in a position of privilege that we haven't necessarily earned by merit. We've earned by birth and genetics. And there's definitely some truth in that, but that makes it very difficult to then start to recognise the issues that might be creating for men.
Totally, and it's both and, isn't it? It's not the case that by acknowledging that there are some emergent challenges that men are facing, that all of a sudden women are sorted and have got everything that they've been after. That's not the case. So I think it requires a bit of sort of subtlety to be able to say, there's massive strides still to take for true equality in the world, and yet there are these things where men are at a disadvantage, and we need to talk about those. But it's hard to acknowledge that.
So we talked in the abstract about men having these challenges, and there's an emerging sort of field. Let's dive into some of the specifics. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges specifically facing men in kind of the modern day?
Well, I think you just need to look at the suicide rate, which is massively distorted towards men. 75% of people who commit suicide are male, and actually you and I are squarely in the sort of spot of where there's the greatest concentration, middle-aged men, 45 to 49, which suggests something profoundly wrong is going on. There's a sort of loneliness epidemic amongst men. 15% of men say they haven't got a close friend, and that's gone up from 3% in 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So
a really interesting stat that leapt out at me was about how men's most common best friend is their wife, and women's most common best friend isn't their husband. Which I think is quite telling as well in terms of like how men and women tend to engage quite differently.
Yeah. I think that's a rather sort of sad picture to be painted, isn't it? And I think there's quite a lot of that sort of those brushstrokes could be made about men's experience of life these days. And in a way, it's no surprise given the lack of role models that are there to model, emotional literacy and vulnerability. And, I guess our parents would have grown up with fathers who'd come out of the trauma of Second World War, an entire nation of men traumatized. So in a way, it's no great surprise that we, to some extent, are the products of that inherited trauma.
Because my grandparents were very much like, don't talk about stuff.
Yeah,
especially the war. It would be, they'd be happy to talk about the good moments of the war and some of the camaraderie stuff,
triumphs,
but get them onto some of the heresy. They just wouldn't go there.
Yeah. And we've all got a sort of grandparent or somebody in that generation in our lives who is known to have not talked about the war, have talked about their experiences. And in a way, they grew up so they came out of the war into a culture that had no sort of practice for dealing with trauma. So of course it was buttoned up. So there's an amazing film called The Mask We Live In, which is all about the cultural forces that shape boys. And one of the more disturbing bits about it is they look at the adult males that typically play roles in young boys' lives, which would often be things like sports coaches, and where there's a sort of powerful narrative that don't show weakness, don't cry if you've lost a match and you shed a tear, you're picked up on that. And I think it's the case that for an awful lot of young boys, even now, the sorts of role modeling they have done from other men in their lives is not to be tender, be emotionally open, to show weakness, or rather, emotions are deemed to be weakness.
Yeah. Boys Don't Cry.
Boys Don't Cry.
Boys Don't Cry was definitely, a line of my childhood.
And I notice it even myself with my son and my daughter, if my son cries, there's a small sort of deep down triggered bit in me that sort of wants to stop him and just tell him to pull his socks up. And I'm aware of it, but that's coming from somewhere that's rooted probably deep in, all that cultural learning.
Yeah. So men sort of have an intrinsic difficulty kind of vocalizing emotions, talking about them a lot. And I guess the biggest, as you mentioned, the biggest sort of issue that comes out of that in concrete terms is mental health that ultimately results in suicidality rates as the sad ultimate measure of it. And do we have to accept that? What can we do to change that and to improve that situation?
I mean, on an individual level, role modeling vulnerability, I think, is really important, and that's at home and in the workplace. I think, there's lots of talk, isn't there, in the world of psychological safety about one of the biggest determinants of whether you create a workplace that's psychologically safe is, do you as a leader model a degree of vulnerability that shows people it's okay to not be the all-knowing, decisive, powerful, unendingly successful human being, or actually are there wrinkles and failings in your world too? And in acknowledging those and talking about them, you create license for other people to open up too. And then at home with my young boy and your sons, the importance of talking sometimes about being sad or not having the answer or having failed at something and that being okay. So I think on a sort of micro level, that modeling is critical.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as a business leader, it often feels like a difficult balance because you want to portray confidence and you want to lead. Strong leadership is kind of sometimes thought of as the opposite of vulnerability in terms of being really clear and self-assured about your path and your way forward. And there can be a perception that modeling vulnerability goes contrary to that. But I think actually if you show that vulnerability, then that at the right times when it's appropriate, and you also show the strong leadership, it makes both of those more powerful potentially.
Yeah, I mean, it would serve no one sort of stand in the middle of the room and go, "I've got no idea what should be happening. I'm completely freaked out." But I think there are judicious moments to demonstrate sort of personal, that sort of tender humanity that says to people, this is a human workplace and I too am a human. And I am also take deep responsibility for the leadership of this organization, but I'm not creating an artifice of that's impossible to meet as a fellow employee.
Yeah. And on the theme of role models, there's some interesting stuff in Boys and Men that you mentioned that men don't have many role models in certain careers as well. And while we at Geiston put a lot of emphasis on trying to present role models for women coming into tech, because women in STEM is definitely underrepresented. And there's actually a corollary of that which many people are ignoring, which is men going into some of the more caring professions like teaching and nursing and medicine, those sorts of things. So role models presumably play an important part of that too.
Yeah, massively. And I think the book talks a lot about this idea that we spent so much, and rightly so much effort recasting the role of women, whilst forgetting that the twin part of that is also recasting the role of men. And so I think it's quite interesting, isn't it, that there's no investment going into getting men into caring careers. Therefore, there are so few men in them that young boys will not recognize in that world, which actually is the growing sort of corner of the employment universe, isn't it? Sort of there's a health education, etc. And yet many of the jobs that men have had for years are in massive decline, manufacturing and heavy industry. And so there's almost a sort of collapse of much of the employment world for men, whilst they're not able to see themselves in this new and abundant emerging world of those other jobs.
Yeah, which is ultimately going to lead in real economic issues if we don't get the men into the places where the jobs are.
Yeah, massively. At a point when there's huge sort of employment crises in those very industries. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels, and this is touched on in that book as well, that women have been told you don't need to just be here, you can be here and here and here as well, which is fantastic. You don't just need to be a carer in the home. You can go and choose the career that you want. You can do the things you want to achieve, which is fantastic. But men were previously told you're the breadwinner, you protect and look after and provide for your family, and that's your role in life. But now that's no longer uniquely yours, because women can go and do that too. But it feels like we haven't been showing the other side of the coin a little bit, which is, and you also you can do these other things, and you must go and grasp them. Like, you can care, you can teach, you can go out and do these other roles. And that's sort of being part of the transition to a more gender equal society that seems to have been lacking.
Massively so. And I think that in a way that's all wrapped up for me slightly in the myth that we can all have it all. We can all both be carers and providers and present parents and amazing caring children. And I think it's incredible that we have achieved this such massive strides on towards equal opportunity being felt as if it is at least within grasp for women. But I also think that there's a twin thing going on, which is women are recognizing that it's not all amazing to have achieved both the professional abundance, but also have the expectation that you'll be a carer at the same time. I think it's really bloody hard, and in a way, that's a twin challenge for men and women to sort of confront together in the family unit. But I think a lot of what we've got is incredibly stressed, run ragged parenting units where no one's quite doing anything brilliantly or well or happily. And then we might look back on this era in years to come and think, God, what were we trying to do? Trying to perform every role of both caring and working and tending and providing together. Was that a sensible thing? And I don't know where we'll end up at the end of this process of re-exploring it. And it's right that we're going through this process at the moment of women grabbing every professional opportunity they can. But I don't think we haven't nailed it.
Yeah, it seems like a really big transition to make from like the standard expectation being one parent out in the workplace and the other parent looking after the family, to being both parents out in the workplace. And hang on, who's looking after the family? Is that the women's job? Because that's really quite unfair.
Completely.
And so, like, actually it should be the woman and the man's job. That sort of came next in the thought line. And I think that sort of, certainly in the generation I grew up in, it was when you have kids, you should be like equal parenting's kind of, if you're both working, you're both parenting, that's it. But now it feels like we're starting to come to a realization that actually that even that's really bloody hard. If both of you are working like full time out in the workplace and you're trying to raise a family, that's an enormous load on the family unit that wasn't felt a generation ago.
Yeah,
because that there was more space in the family unit.
And we also don't have the benefit of intergenerational learning around this, because our parents were not modeling what we're trying to do. And so in a way, we're trying to work it all out on our own whilst it never having been done before.
Yeah.
And I think it feels clumsy and we're misfiring. But it's a hell of a load. And I do wonder, and I don't know whether this is how controversial it is, but Richard Reeves certainly talks about in his book this idea that we're expecting us to be equal or exactly the same in how we parent and the contribution we make to our families. Whereas perhaps what he's raising seems to be as a question is are there specific roles that fathers play and specific roles that mothers play? And in try and sort of merge and have this homogenous parenting mode that we should both be in, we lose the subtle but important differences. So, he talks about this idea of, men have often performed teaching roles within families and women perhaps a more sort of tending role. But we're not quite sure whether that's okay anymore or it's okay even to talk about. And so perhaps we expect as men to be in the tending role as an equivalent to what the women are doing, and yet we haven't had it role modeled to us, nor perhaps is it necessarily quite as innate to us. And in doing so, we abandon perhaps a teaching role that's really important. So I think there's some sort of unraveling and working out and some clarity that needs to emerge about what our respective roles are in a family unit, whilst also recognizing that we need to hold the weight equally, just perhaps in different ways.
Yeah. And how can we facilitate the space for these sorts of conversations? I mean, you run Campfire, which is fantastic for men to be able to like think about this stuff and engage with it, but it's, you know, for the privileged few, I feel incredibly lucky to be able to do it. But what can we do to spread that practice a bit more widely, do you think?
Well, I think there's mercifully the most amazing proliferation of really accessible, affordable, free groups for men. I mean, Bristol's got Talk Club, which is an incredible thing to have emerged in the last few years, which is entirely free and charitable. And there are lots all around the country. If you were to just look up anywhere and sort of Google local men's group, you'd be able to find something. But again, it's quite a big thing to go from not talking about it to suddenly stepping into a room with a bunch of strangers and talking about it. So I suppose, like, you know, in our small ways in families, we can have conversations about gender roles around the kitchen table. We can talk with our sons and our daughters about these sorts of things. We can talk to our sons about and cultivate in them an openness to talking about feelings. And I think the stuff you're doing around, you know, celebrating International Men's Day and at least raising the profile of it in organizations, again, you know, all that stuff helps and works.
Yeah. And is there something about, so the Talk Club thing is asking people how they are, but not just how they are, but out of 10 to just probe a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
It feels like we need to spread a bit more of a culture of that, so both socially and within our workspaces as well, where you know, you're encouraged to learn the language of emotion, especially. So I think there's maybe something generational here as well, where I think people of our generation are really quite illiterate when it comes to emotions. In terms of our vocabulary and language and ability to talk about this stuff. Whereas I think a lot of younger people coming into the workplace are perhaps a little bit more, not necessarily comfortable, but just equipped and able and practiced to be able to talk about how they feel a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt, isn't there, that sort of the leaps that are made from our parents' generation to us and then to what our kids are displaying. And I think it's really interesting when you look at gathering a group of men together for the first time to talk about their emotions, which can happen in Campfire, that men will often default to then talking about data. So how are you? Well, I'm having this time at work that in this such and such is happening. And actually, if you're asking someone to sort of state how they're feeling, they'll quickly jump to a thought. And so that's why the question like, how are you out of 10 is such a brilliant one, because it rather than being I'm fine, it invites an explanation or at least an investigation of how you're feeling. But yeah, I mean, my sort of uncles and people in that generation, I don't think I've ever heard them talk about how they're feeling.
Yeah. They talk about how they're doing.
They talk what and how they're doing. Yeah. And that's, you know, it's one of the things which I love about Campfire is that we've sort of moved beyond that. You know, so instead of just talking about stuff, we're actually talking about what's going on in our lives, and that creates a sort of a connection and a tenderness that I think is really important. And you do hear about the sort of generation emerging now, and I know there's a lot of critique, isn't there, about Gen Z, and I think as employers and as people of our generation, I think it's often easy to nobble them for the things that we see as being different from us. But there's no doubt that their ability to take care of their mental health, to even have that as an idea that is something that needs to be looked after, I think is absolutely there. It's part of that generation.
Yeah, and you know, coming back to the sad topic of suicidality among men, it's obviously so important to start with that awareness and discussion, in order to be able to kind of strike at the root of some of those problems.
Yeah, completely.
So I sometimes describe Campfire to people as group coaching, which sort of brings me on to the idea of coaching and what that can do for people in terms of opening up some of these conversations and dialogues. We've used coaching within Gladstone quite a bit, and one of the routes we did to get into that was to use More Happy, which I know you've been involved with as well. Do you want to just say a little bit about More Happy and kind of how that can help facilitate some of these problems?
Sure. So I mean, More Happy was designed to try and remove the massive barrier to coaching, which is the cost. And I think there's wide acceptance that coaching is an amazing thing. And that's why loads of leaders and people on senior teams and some of the most high profile business people in the world have coaching. But it's hitherto been a really expensive thing to take on. And the whole idea, more happy to say, well, can we remove the pricing barrier by do some clever parts of the business model that enable early career coaches to work with SMEs and charities as part of their career development to support the employees of those organizations. And it's been amazing. We've delivered 20,000 or more coaching sessions across hundreds of organizations. And what it does is it enables those coaching conversations to happen at very junior levels within organizations about, what do you want to be doing? What confidence issues are you in front of at the moment? What's your experience of being a first-time manager? Can you cultivate better skills around difficult conversations at work? All those really huge blockers around soft skills that often stand in the way of people being really juiced and alive and capable and proficient at work are often the soft things, not the technical skills. So it's been amazing to witness, and I think genuinely transformative for the people who've had it.
Yeah, and that's definitely the stories we've heard from people around Geiston is in terms of sort of clarity, motivation, drive, but also just general mental health. So, by which I mean sort of maintenance of and promotion of health rather than treatment of poor mental health, if that makes sense. I think it's really, really powerful in that sense.
And I think it's a hell of a lot to ask that the leadership in an organization can be available to the people in an organization in the way that a coach can, which is there's no power structures here in the room. I, as a coach, I have no say over your pay. I don't have a say over whether you get promoted, which is riddled in the dynamics that happen between managers and their reports. And so that enables really honest conversations to happen. And I think those honest conversations surface things like, will I ever be happy in this job? And if not, it's time that I move on from it, rather than stay in the organization and which is bad for both the employee and the organization. Those conversations can't really happen very cleanly with somebody who manages you. And also, if it's typically older people in management roles in organizations, we've already said earlier in the conversation that they are often not the generation that is particularly sort of well equipped in emotional literacy terms to have those conversations. So I think it's no admission of failure at all to say, well, let's bring in people whose entire job is to focus on supporting those employees in a very uncomplicated coaching relationship that has some training and expertise behind it in how to cultivate the right sort of depth of conversation that gets people to really understand what's going on for them.
Yeah. And that really is the key, isn't it? To just get those conversations flowing that aren't around the day-to-day, what are you doing, how are you performing at X task, but thinking about the human that sits in there and how they're feeling about it, how it's impacting their life, how their life's impacting it. Yeah, those conversations are much easier to happen in an emotional language and framework that sits outside the normal day-to-day work.
Completely. And I think Geiston, from all that you've described, it has a very sort of thoughtful and intentional approach about how it works on the people side of its business. But many organizations just dump people into management positions because they need a promotion and that's the obvious next place for them to go. But the art of being a manager is a very sort of subtle human thing that involves huge sensitivity and understanding and reading of human dynamics. And the idea that you can just dump someone in that, not having had the experience, and hope that they can just crack on with it is a bit of a stretch. And that's where I think coaching or coaching type conversations end up being super helpful, because they can help people sort of understand where they're perhaps tripping over and not doing a good job on that front.
Yeah, especially when you've got the intergenerational issues that we talked about before. So yeah, as a manager, you've been managed in a way that is probably quite emotionally illiterate. That's how you've learned to manage, by seeing that.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
And so to be able to break out that is really hard.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. If my own experience has been a terrible manager, what else am I going to do other than ape what I've seen?
Yeah. So if you were to give one takeaway to our listeners in terms of what they could do to help have some of these discussions get men's issues on the agenda and their shortcomings, if you like, of their inability to talk about this stuff in general, as is often the case, what would you kind of one tip to kind of help move us in the right direction be?
It's probably the hardest one to actually do, but probably the most impactful, which would be to model vulnerability. I think it doesn't have to be a bare rule, but I think if you can, as a man inside an organization, think, what could I do to model the very thing I'm asking of or want to see in the men who work for me? I think that feels probably one of the biggest things you can do. And then on a more prosaic level, I absolutely love the talk clubs. How are you out of 10? It's such a simple question. Where in the veg? Such a simple question, but often those are the best ones, right?
Yeah.
And we just know that asking how are you will give a deflected answer, but how are you out of 10? If it comes up at 7, then the question is, well, what would make it an 8?
Yeah.
And from there, you can begin to tease out unexpected stuff.
Yeah. Great conversation starter. Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rick.
It's been a pleasure.